เราจะมาฟังต่อครับว่าแล้วทั่วโลกล่ะเขาทำอะไรอยู่ถ้าเราจะต้องเลือกทำงานวิจัยทิศทางที่ทั่วโลกนะที่นักวิจัยในระดับโลกมองว่าเป็นทิศทางที่ควรจะเดินไปนี่คืออะไร I would like to invite Professor Matthew Stephenson from Harvard Law School. He teaches many subjects, but he works on various anti-corruption research. He wrote many articles in each year. Apart from that, Matthew also managed Global Anti-Corruption Blog, very well-known blog that anti-corruption experts and academics all around the world need to follow.
It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to return to Bangkok and to return to Chula. I've been invited today to speak generally about international trends in academic research and academic scholarship on good governance and anti-corruption. Of course, research on good governance and anti-corruption takes a wide variety of forms and asks a wide variety of questions. Some research projects are concerned principally with understanding the effects or impacts of corruption. There's other research that's focused on understanding the causes of corruption, especially the root causes or the systemic causes of corruption. And there's yet other research, perhaps more immediately practically focused, that wants to better understand potential solutions to corruption or responses to corruption, the effectiveness of different kinds of public policy interventions. So let me start out by saying a little bit about the evolution of this field, how research on corruption and anti-corruption has developed over time. Prior to the mid-1990s, most academic work on corruption and anti-corruption, at least in the fields with which I am familiar, tended to be either theoretical or focused on qualitative case studies, historical or contemporary case studies. And a great deal of this research was quite useful. We still make use of a lot of the ideas that emerged from this earlier period, but there wasn't a lot of systematic, certainly quantitative, empirical social science analysis because, as most people who work in this field are well aware, corruption is extraordinarily difficult to measure. It's a hidden and clandestine activity, and therefore it's very difficult to do anything like a quantitative statistical comparison. That started to change in the 1990s with the appearance of a larger set of these international indexes, good governance or anti-corruption indexes. The most famous is probably something called the Corruption Perceptions Index, or CPI, which has been published annually since the mid-1990s by a civil society organization called Transparency International. But the World Bank has also produced a set of indicators called the Worldwide Governance Indicators. There are 6 of them, one on corruption and anti-corruption, but there are also indicators on things like political stability, rule of law, and so forth. In addition to these country-level corruption or governance indicators, there's also been a proliferation of country-level indexes or rankings for a variety of other variables that we might care of, things like democracy or press freedom or transparency, and so on and so forth. So what we saw in the field from about the late 1990s through the 2000s and continuing, even up to today, this research is still going on, but especially, I would say, in the 2000s. There was just this profusion of quantitative empirical research on corruption, anti-corruption, and other aspects of governance that ran statistical regressions using as key data, either as an outcome variable or as an explanatory variable, these perceptions indexes of corruption and governance. As many people pointed out, many of these indexes are based primarily on perceptions, either perceptions of the local population or the perceptions of international experts. And while perceptions can be useful indicators for reality sometimes, they can also be misleading. They're not always a good representation of reality. Also, trying to generate a single numerical score for a phenomenon as complicated as corruption, aggregated at the country level, inevitably obscures a lot of important complexity and variation. For the last 15 years or so, I think we've seen a number of important trends in international research on corruption and good governance that I think it would be useful. There are many such trends, but I want to highlight three that I think are particularly notable. The first I would describe as a shift in focus from the macro to the micro. What I mean by that is there's an increasing amount of research that instead of trying to look at cross-national comparisons with the complex phenomenon of corruption aggregated to a single measure at the country level, there's been an increasing focus on research that looks at particular jurisdictions, that looks within countries, that looks at particular kinds of corruption or particular sectors or certain kinds of transactions. So again, whereas the research from the mid-1990s and then for the next 15 or 20 years emphasize cross-national comparisons and big picture questions like, is corruption correlated with economic growth or is corruption correlated with democracy, the more recent trends in the research have looked at more focused particular questions like, does disclosing information about government grants to local schools in publicly accessible format lead to less money missing from those schools' budgets? Or does requiring teachers to photograph themselves with their class at the end of each session reduce absenteeism in classrooms? Or does getting local villagers together to discuss and consider how to allocate the local development budget lead to less wasted resources or stolen materials in road building projects and so forth? So those are the kinds of more focused, targeted questions that have increasingly been the emphasis of good government and anti-corruption research, both in terms of the jurisdictions or the type of data being looked at, or local level rather than country level, and also the kinds of research questions being asked, much more focused in that sense. Second, we have seen a shift in the strategy for addressing the problem that corruption is inherently difficult to measure. This is just a persistent problem. It's never going to go away probably in our field, in this field. Corruption is hidden activity. The people who engage in it have an incentive to keep it secret. And it's also not the kind of thing that just lends itself to easy quantification. But for those researchers who want to engage in something like quantitative empirical analysis, you need to find some way to address that problem. Now, I should add for a moment, not all research needs to be engaged in quantitative empirical analysis. I mentioned that most serious anti-corruption research before the mid-1990s was either theoretical or used qualitative case studies, and that's still extraordinarily valuable, and many people are still using that approach. I'm speaking right now for those people who wanted to engage in a more systematic quantitative empirical study. So whereas the focus in the previous generation, that period I described from the mid-90s on, was on using perceptions as a proxy for reality, more recent research has resorted to a range of other kinds of techniques, including what is sometimes referred to as forensic economics or forensic statistics more generally. That's just a term meaning looking for clues, indirect evidence of the existence of the hidden behavior that we care about, and then deriving from that a quantitative measure that we can use that's not simply based on asking either local citizens or international experts, how corrupt do you think this country is, give it a score on a 1 to 10 scale. So what do some of these forensic techniques look like? Well, one that springs to mind that was sort of interesting concerned research that was done in South Africa or Southern Africa that tried to estimate the corruption costs associated with exporting through a particular port in a country that was known to have a big problem of corruption in its ports. And what the researchers did, there was another port in the same general vicinity that had a reputation for being clean without much of a corruption problem. And they looked at various firms in the same line of business and where they chose to export, because they could calculate the transportation cost to get from any firm's location to a port. And what they noticed is some firms, even though they were closer to the port that had a reputation for greater corruption, were shipping their goods through the clean port. And so they could calculate exactly how much extra transportation cost a firm was willing to bear to export through port A rather than port B and use that to back out a guess about the hidden extra cost. Now, those wouldn't necessarily have to be corruption, but there's a lot of reason to suspect that they might well be exactly that. There are other measures that look at price differentials, difference in price being paid for certain goods in certain markets versus other markets. There are other techniques as well. There's also been an increasing use of direct observation, which you would think would be hard or impossible, but there are some researchers who actually have associates or confederates embed themselves in local communities and gain people's trust and be willing to just ride around with people in trucks and see how often police officers at checkpoints ask for bribes and how much and secretly record this. So we see this as well. So this is the second development I'll describe. I'm doing it very briefly, but the big picture idea I want to get across is there is a challenge in corruption research in measuring or quantifying this inherently clandestine activity. And while earlier researchers tended to get around this problem by leaning heavily on perception-based measures, the trend in the literature is to try to use, where possible, direct observation, but in other cases, these so-called forensic economic techniques to come up with clever ways to measure hidden activities indirectly. The third important trend, that's the problem of determining causation. So we can take a bunch of data about corruption and a bunch of data about other factors we might care about, economic growth, foreign direct investment, political freedom, press freedom, transparency, whatever, and we can run some regressions and we can get some correlations. The problem, though, is figuring out whether those correlations tell us something about a causal relationship or whether they're spurious or the causal relationship goes the other direction. Many of you will be familiar with this already, but I'll illustrate with maybe the simplest, most straightforward example, which is also probably familiar for anyone who's thought about this topic. The relationship between corruption and per capita income, national wealth. Countries that are wealthy, that have higher per capita incomes, on average, have lower levels of corruption, at least according to these perception measures. Well, what does that tell us? It is possible, it is easier for rich countries to fight corruption, that becoming richer will lead to reductions in corruption, that having clean government leads to economic growth and greater national wealth, and that cleaning up the government will raise per capita incomes. It is also possible that both of these things affect each other at the same time. And it is also possible that these things don't actually have any direct causal relationship with one another, but rather are both caused by some other underlying factor, like geography, or a history of colonial domination, or something about the culture. Could be that both low corruption and high growth derive from some underlying source, but they're not related. I'm not endorsing any of these views. I'm just using this as a simple example to illustrate the basic problem. When we're relying on observational data, correlations in observational data, there's a deep problem of determining causation. But causation is ultimately what many of us really care about. It's not a problem that can be easily solved. The earlier wave of research, particularly this wave of research that emphasized the Corruption Perceptions Index and other national level data, tried to get at the causation problem by using fancy statistical techniques. There's a set of fancy statistical techniques that one can try to use, but there's something called instrumental variables for data that is at least allegedly over time, so-called time series data. There are a range of statistical techniques that people can try to use to figure out whether basically it's fancy math, but it's really if one thing happens before the other, we can assume that thing, the first thing caused the second thing. There's kind of a profusion of fancier and fancier statistical techniques that people attempted to use to squeeze causal information out of correlational data. Some of this was somewhat useful, but there really is a limit. It doesn't matter how fancy your math gets. Ultimately, the nature of the data is what it is. And I do think we hit a point in the research literature where people were trying to make up for the inherent problems in the data, in the information we had, by using extremely fancy or progressively fancier mathematical techniques, which can sometimes obscure the fact that you just don't know what you don't know. And so the trend in the research literature that I think has been a very encouraging trend over the last 10 to 20 years has been to try to address the causation problem less through the use of fancy statistical techniques at the back end and more on thoughtful, clever research design at the front end, not relying simply on kind of off-the-shelf data sets with country-level numbers and then trying to run the regressions in 100 different ways, but designing specific research projects that can more reliably give information about causal effects. So if you want to determine causation, the ideal, what statisticians often refer to as the gold standard, is randomization. You can control for everything else if you just assign half of the subjects of your study a particular intervention, and the other half you don't assign that intervention, and you pick them at random, then you can be pretty confident that if you see an effect in the first group, it really is due to that factor that you changed and not to anything else. You can never be 100% confident of anything, but highly confident. One of the most exciting developments, not just in good governance and anti-corruption research, but development economics or economics generally in the last 15 to 20 years, has been the explosion in the use of so-called randomized controlled trials or field experiments to try to get more reliable information about the causal effect of different potential interventions, in this context particularly anti-corruption or pro-good governance interventions. Now, the RCT approach is extremely valuable. It has its limitations, some of which I'll talk more about in a moment. It is expensive, it is time-consuming, and it only allows the investigation of a pretty narrow subset of the questions that we're interested in. Only those, basically, where you can get some collaborator, usually a government or an international organization, to agree to allow you to randomize a particular policy intervention. In the research literature, though, in addition to the expanded use of randomized experiments, we've seen increasing emphasis on identifying and exploiting so-called natural experiments. For those of you who are not familiar with this, a natural experiment is basically something where randomization happened not because the researcher or the experimenter went out and got people to agree to randomization, but just because the nature of the way a policy was implemented turned out to be either random or close to random. So, for example, a country is rolling out a new anti-corruption monitoring system and doesn't roll it out in every province all at once. It rolls it out in some first and others later, and they seem to be chosen haphazardly or on the basis of factors that we have reason to think have nothing to do with corruption or governance. That would be an example. There are other techniques as well. Again, I won't get into the details. So again, those are the three big trends I wanted to highlight in my remarks. So let me just close with a few thoughts on some things that I think are quite important in the field given these trends that might be especially relevant to this audience. First, as I was just saying, it's really important to involve researchers who have deep local knowledge, deep institutional knowledge, deep relationships with local governments, civil society organizations, and other collaborators. I think the best research, the important research going forward, is going to be research that really is based on deep understandings of systems, knowledge of particular policy choices that could generate natural experiments, relationships, collaborative relationships with governments or CSOs that could allow the implementation of randomized trials and so on. Which leads me to the second thing I wanted to emphasize, given the way the research trends are going, and that is the importance of collaboration. Collaboration across disciplines, collaboration among scholars with different kinds of expertise, collaboration between academic researchers and those more directly involved in the policy space, and so forth. It will be unusual that any one researcher, any one person has all of the skills and background necessary to execute the kinds of research projects that I've just been describing, where the trends in this area are going. The third thing is support and resources from those in a position to provide them. That includes universities for researchers that are based on universities and outside funders or supporters. The research that will need to be done in the future, not all of it, but a lot of it, will be randomized experiments in the field, ongoing long-term longitudinal studies, and that these things take time, and it often will take resources and backing. That can be a challenge because I am well aware funders often want to see short-term results, like what have you been doing with our money? And oftentimes the most important research in this field won't necessarily generate very short-term results, so a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year ongoing project. So I think it's therefore very important to be able to explain clearly the nature of the research they're doing and why it's important and why it will take time and what the useful outcomes will be. There are no easy wins, there are no quick hits, there's not really that much low-hanging fruit. And then of course it's incumbent on us in the research community to follow up with that to gain credibility with the supporters by being able to show just how productive that long-term investment in valid, rigorous scientific knowledge about corruption and anti-corruption will be.